Hello, and welcome to the journey through the solar system. But before I get into the day-by-day process of looking at the individual planets, I really want to talk about this meet the gods. It was very unusual for me, my own approach to what is commonly referred to as esoteric knowledge. I was not somebody that was particularly interested in any of these things. I certainly wasn't the kind of person that knew anything about astrology, or I didn't meet the I Ching until I ended up on the island of Ibiza well into my adulthood. So my relationship with the gods was not one that was the planets, in that sense, was not one that was based on any kind of sort of modern analytical concept. It was pretty much what I had learned in school, that is, the gods as they were interpreted, the planets as they were interpreted as personalities by the Greeks and by the Romans, and what came down to me in North America as the mythology of that era. Mythology was something that was interesting to me, but again, the association of the planets directly into my life was not something that I was particularly aware of or concerned about. The most fascinating thing for me is that in my own personal process, I entered into design in that sense. I entered into the relationship of any human being with the planets without any real prejudices. I knew very little about them. I didn't have the astrologer's background or the language of analysis or any of those things that go with the study of the planets. So I was rather innocent in the nature of my own relationship with them. For me, the transiting program has been a deep teacher in my process all these many years. And more than that, the ability to be able to see how the imprinting on the outside works on the inside. That is, the way in which we can translate information from the edge of the mandala, from the wheel itself. We can place that information within the vehicle, gives us an opportunity to focus in those particular places and to get a sense of the energy that we meet. Every single one of the gates that I have that open up into a channel where there is no definition, that they have provided me with the most extraordinary opportunity of all, that is to meet the gods directly. I have my own deep understanding of the planets, but it's not based on so much what has been written in the mythology. Yes, of course, there are archetypes that are standard, archetypes that are valid, but it's the nuance, it's the feel. The moment that you meet a planet in a channel, I'm somebody who is unemotional, and it's very obvious to me the different ways in which emotionality can be triggered in me, conditioned in me, and not simply by the fact that the emotional system gets defined, which has a generic value as an energy force, as a wave force, but it's more than that. I only have one gate in the emotional system, the 49th gate, and I have tracked over many years now the experience of different planets coming to the 19th gate and emotionalizing my system. And it is so fascinating to see the difference between how Mercury will apply the 19 pressure as opposed to how Venus or Jupiter, or for that matter Neptune, now brings its subtlety, its quality. And it is through this recognition, through one's design, where one is open to conditioning from the general imprint, that you can begin to have your own relationship, your own direct relationship with what I enjoy calling the gods. That is, your own direct relationship with the imprinting forces that are so deeply influencing your life and everyone else's life. And rather than meeting the gods based on their reputation, This is an opportunity to meet the gods face to face, and in meeting them face to face, grasp their essence. It's a fascinating experience. There's no better day to talk about the moon than Monday. It's day. The moon has an enormous impact in our lives. We actually have a very unusual configuration in the astronomy of it. That is that the only other planet that has a singular moon is Pluto, and it's not even certain in that context whether Pluto is a legitimate planet. The other thing is the proportional relationship. That is the relationship of the size of the moon to the size of the Earth, that the moon is really enormous in that sense, in proportion. Even when you go to the largest moon in the solar system, Titan, when you compare it to the size of Saturn, it is a much smaller proportion than the relationship between the Earth and the moon. So we have this singular moon, and it's very large in relationship to our planet, and has an enormous impact on the planet. If it were not for the presence of the moon, if this were indeed an evolved water planet, there would be no Earth. There would be nothing pulled up. There would be no life in the sense as we know it. Just the idea of standing erect, the way in which human beings move around on this planet is all courtesy of the moon and its gravitational impact on the Earth. We know that the seas rise and fall relative to the moon, and yet we seem to end it at the seashore, and we don't realize, or we don't know, that in fact everything is rising and falling. The blood in your body, the liquid in your cells, the very land that you stand on is pulled by the moon. So the moon has an enormous effect in our life. Within the context of human design, within the context of analysis, we speak of the moon as a drive. It is an engine that is powerfully at work, trying to dominate where we go. This reflected light of the moon. And the moon is always there and always willing to carry out the message of the sun. It is there to embody that message, but to embody it not so much as input, but as direction, as force, as drive. And so this moon that we have, when you look at your personality moon, when you look at your design moon, how deeply significant it is. In fact, the moon is so significant that really 3 of the aspects of calculation are lunar related. That is, the nodes of the moon. The tradition of the Brahmins was that incarnation, in fact, was something that was a result of the moon. So when we're looking at the moon individually in our lives, you also have to see that this is also the reflected light that others see in you. It is your inner nature, in a sense, brought to the surface, and placed on display. The moon, the eldest daughter. We would have a very, very difficult time without her. She is really the protectress of us all. For me, the lunar goddesses were always the ones that in essence really were directly involved with our lives down here on the mundane plane, guiding us into the material acceptance of life, moving us, driving us through this material life. And in many ways, it's more like a tug, like the tug of the moon. It's there, and it's pulling all of us. And it's important for you to see where your moon is pulling you to stand up and be on display. Hello, and today we're going to begin with the innermost planet, and we're going to start with Mercury. Mercury is closest to the sun. There's all kinds of mythology about the relationship between Mercury and the sun. That Mercury is, in the masculine sense, the eldest son, the one that carries its father's light. And Mercury traditionally has been, as it is in the Mercury myth itself, a messenger of the gods. And it's not so much that Mercury brings a message from the gods as Mercury brings the capacity to move messages. In other words, communication. And everything about the Mercury archetype, whether that is Mercury or Prometheus or Loki or any of these kinds of gods, that basically what they represent is an expansion of human consciousness, and mostly that expansion of human consciousness through forms of communication. By the way, that communication doesn't have to be simply words. Like Hermes, it can be music as well. In other words, this is an archetype of the need within oneself to communicate. And it is the imprinting capacity to communicate. Now, of course, when we're dealing with human design, we are dealing with not a single Mercury. When you're looking at your chart, you're looking at a binary, always the binary. On one side, you have the conscious Mercury. And it's very important for you just to notice, just very simply, where is that Mercury of yours, that conscious Mercury, the one that you have conscious access to, the one that you think of as you. It is this Mercury in this particular position that gives you an insight into what truly you need to communicate in this life, what you need to get across in this life, what you need to reach out and deliver to the other as a message in this life. But it's more than just the phenomena of what our personality wants to communicate. Of course, there's also what our form wants to communicate. And it is one of the deeper insights into the operation of the unconscious, is to really see what our unconscious wants to communicate. So often we find ourselves in situations where, we are actually communicating to someone what in fact we don't even know why we're telling them what we're telling them. We don't know where that's coming from. But remember that our design also is imprinted with a capacity to communicate. That need to communicate and the need of that essence, wherever that Mercury happens to be, that design Mercury. Look very carefully at your design Mercury. It's a deep insight into why there seems to be this consistent theme in you that needs to be expressed, while at the same time your personality doesn't know why. Doesn't really understand nor accept why that seems to be a theme that you're trying to get across. And it's one of the things to realize about looking at your design Mercury is that you can begin to see within yourself that so much of what we call our life is the deep limitation of only being identified with our personalities. It is the whole life. It is the whole life that has a capacity to communicate. And that capacity to communicate is a binary, but it's a binary that when it operates correctly, the whole that's greater than the sum of the parts is the form itself, the totality itself, being able to communicate properly. What's so interesting about looking at the personality and the design Mercury in your chart is to begin to see that there is a synthesis between those juxtaposed elements. In other words, that both the expression that is demanded within the unconscious and the obvious need to communicate the theme that is present in the conscious, that only when they're operating correctly will a larger theme be communicated. This is the mystical part of what life is. This is how we get to a place of, experiencing our purpose. Our purpose is not experienced by being limited to one side of the equation or the other. This is not about this and that. The whole key in human design, in operating correctly as yourself, is that there is an intrinsic harmony between the this and that is you. In other words, between the personality and the design. That it operates correctly as a totality. And when it's operating correctly as a totality, what in essence then can be communicated is the transcendent synthetic communication that's rooted in both the need of the design Mercury and the need of the personality Mercury to communicate its specific activated themes. Hello, and welcome to Venus Friday. And Venus is always traditionally associated with Friday. It's the fifth day of the week, and Venus is associated with the five-pointed star. I think it's rather common knowledge, but it's worth repeating that there was a real change in consciousness in Mediterranean society about 4,000 years ago, and basically that transformation in the consciousness had to do with the roles of the male and the female. Men, not being the brightest of creatures, took a very long time to figure out how women became pregnant. And the matriarchy ruled for a very long time. It's one of my favorite comments is that the matriarchy was written out of history by Homer, who was the chief propagandist for the new rise of the patriarchy. And this was symbolized by the relationship between Ulysses and his wife, Penelope. She was queen, and as queen, she had husbands that were selected, that were her consorts for 1 year, and at the end of that 1 year, they were ritually butchered and cooked and served at a festival. And then the next husband would, be her partner for a year. This was the power of the matriarchy. And then came Ulysses, and just before it was time for that festival chopping, sorry honey, I have to go off to war. And he went away for a very long time, and she could not remarry because he had not been killed, and he refused to be killed. And that symbolically ended up being the end of when he returned and killed all the suitors. It ended up, demolishing the power of the female and the female goddesses that were associated with the female spirit. And it began a counter-revolution. That is, it began a process of deconstructing and rewriting the mythology of the time. No longer were the female gods given the great power. Their powers were diminished. And no greater example is that of Venus. And it's one in which it's a common example that I use because it shows the distortion if one is only aligned to one particular cultural appraisal. Venus was transformed, particularly by the Romans, and the mythology of Venus as a goddess of love. And if you ask most people to describe to you the archetype of Venus, they're not very far away from, the boudoir. The fact of the matter is that Friday is a day for, punishment by death in certain countries on the planet still today. Venus's day. It is well documented that in the South American Mayan cultures that Venus was the star of execution, that ritual executions would take place when she would rise in the sky. Her name was the Eye. It's something to keep in mind about the nature of Venus. Venus is very, very powerful and deeply misunderstood. And at the very core of Venus in your design is the essence or the key of what Venus represents as an imprint. That is, it brings morality, mores. Where Jupiter operates with a very generalized law, Venus is dealing with natural law, the natural way in which we deal with the other and with the consequences of the world around us. And Venus is in charge of our moral stance. Now, to see the moral questions that lie there in your life, the moral dilemma of this and that, the moral dilemma of what is right and what is wrong, the moral dilemma of what disturbs you at the moral level in your relationship with this or that, that all you need to do is look at the activations of Venus in your design. You look at your personality Venus, and when you're looking at the position of that activation of your personality Venus, you're looking at that gate and you're looking at that line, is that what you're dealing with is the basic moral dilemma that you're going to work with as a personality in your life. The right and the wrong for you. And that the whole thing about the nature of Venus is that here is a place where if you do not act with moral clarity, those around you do not act with moral clarity, this is a Venus that can be very nasty in its retribution. An interesting thing to ponder about the goddess of love. Hello, and welcome to the Mars. Boy, if you read the mythology of the Roman god, one would consider the imprint of Mars to be quite frightening. It's one of the most interesting things about the way in which the nature of the planets have been interpreted historically. If you go back to the very beginnings of what is commonly known as astrology, that is Western astrology that was developed in Babylonia. If you go back to the Babylonian astrologers, the nature of their description of the planets, and of course it was limited to 7 planets at that time, their description of the planets was very black and white, if you will. A god of war was a god of war, and it was as simple as that. And one of the most interesting things about the nature of the planets themselves is that over these thousands of years, the planets have changed. That is, the way in which we describe their energy, despite the fact that there is a continuity that goes back to the original black and white of it, that there has been an evolution, if you will, in the way in which we describe the imprint. And of course the fact is that it is an evolution. In other words, that, as the consciousness of the planet has developed, as human consciousness has expanded, then it's been open to higher frequencies of recognition. In other words, that, we're no longer limited to the primary imprint of any particular planet. We've already transcended that to a point where our interpretations are quite sophisticated. It is not uncommon today to see this blending of astrological understanding with modern psychology and modern philosophy. In other words, that we're able now to extrapolate out of these very primary imprints a vast nuance of description. So what does that mean in relationship to Mars? And by the way, when you think about the fact that it's one of my favorite topics, the neutrino and the neutrino with mass were imprinted as a byproduct of the neutrino with mass. The neutrinos go pouring through Mars and they come through us, and we are impacted by the transition that takes place when they oscillate as they move through Mars. And that Martian imprint is carried into our crystals. But something to consider, just because the sentence ends there doesn't mean that the neutrino ends there. It's one of those things about the nature of the neutrino is that it is rather difficult to capture one and hold it still. These are things that are keeping on moving. And so one of the things to keep in mind about our relationship with the environment around us is just as it is programming us, we are already programming it at the same time. As the neutrino information of Mars moves through us, the fact of the matter is that those neutrinos go back out in space, and they're traveling at nearly the speed of light. They get back to Mars in a hurry. And it's something to keep in mind about the nature of our relationship with any object, and why objects have certain values is that as long as we generally, as a generic, look upon an object with the same reference, that is what the object itself is imprinted with, which only increases the density of that imprint when the neutrinos are coming in the other direction and are programming us. Okay, but I've traveled quite away from Mars, so let's get to Mars. One of the things to keep in mind about Mars in your design is that basically what you are looking at is that you are looking at an extraordinary energy resource. It's an energy resource, but it's an immature energy resource. In other words, it is something that has a force that lacks refinement. And wherever you look at your Mars in your design, whether it's the personality Mars or it is the unconscious Mars, it's so important to see that the themes where those Mars positions are, the activations, the gates that they're in, the lines that they're in, that there's going to be a demand in this life in order for you to operate correctly, to slowly refine that energy. That energy is going to be subject to outburst. It is going to be subject to immaturity. And the thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about an archetype of a great warrior. It is not that this immaturity in and of itself is something that is eternal. It isn't. It is a process. And one of the most interesting things about Mars is that to live correctly with your Martian energy ultimately is to get to a place of great wisdom when it comes to the use of energy. And again, I'm being specific to the places where the activations are going to be. There is ultimately a maturity that waits down the road. It is a refinement of this energy. Now, it's not like you can do anything about it, after all. I mean, it's not like you can look at your unconscious Mars and its position and understand why you have had those kinds of outbursts out of that particular theme. It isn't going to stop it from happening in the future if your operating is not self. Again, it goes back always in human design to the basics. You have to operate correctly. There are too many things to think about. There are too many things to think about to even imagine that the mind in some way is going to be able to grasp all of this and make your life better. I mean, that's the illusion the mind's always trying to give you. Forget that. All you have to do is operate correctly as yourself, and your Martian energy will mature over time. And those gates where Mars sit, something to keep in mind about those gates. There's extraordinary potential in them, but over time. Hello, and welcome to the day we look at Saturn. Saturn's one of my favorites. As a matter of fact, my own personal experience with Saturn convinces me that Saturn is a female, a yin, if you will, in yang clothing. I think this goes back to very, very ancient yin forces that were transformed by Greco-Roman mythology with the advent of the rise of the male as the dominant force, the patriarchy. But Saturn is an extraordinary force in our lives, and in terms of human design analysis, Saturn's particularly important in the chart because it tends to be a focus place. Saturn really represents it's like being a judge in a way. Whatever you do in your life that is incorrect according to your nature, it doesn't matter what it is. Whatever you do that's incorrect, if there is a price to be paid, the place where you pay the price is not where you lived out that process or what initiated that process. The place where you pay the price is wherever your Saturns are. In other words, the position of your Saturn in your design really tells you something. This is the place of not only vulnerability, in the sense that it is through the Saturn position that you're going to have to deal with the consequences of your actions. But it's more than that. That is, it is one of the most profound signposts that we have. And of course, signpost is one of those favorites of mine. These kinds of forces or activations that allow you over time to be able to see your own progress in your own process. You know, it's one of the things about Saturn is that if you mess up even a little bit, then you're going to pay the Saturnian price. But if you're just great, if you do everything just great, it's not like Saturn shows up and pats you on the back and says, "Hey, you've been terrific. You just don't pay a price." It is a reward that is really profound. You just don't pay the price. So looking at the Saturns in your design is very significant. You know, the fact is that most of the things that get us into difficulty in this life, that is our open centers, these gates of ours that are pointed towards open centers where we're so susceptible to conditioning in this life, that we end up getting caught in something because of that kind of conditioning force, or make decisions on the mental plane, and yet regardless of where it came from, we end up paying the price in the same place, wherever those Saturns are. And the difficulty is not so much in the personality Saturn, because again, with the personality we have conscious access to it, so that we can be very much aware of how powerful that Saturnian position is. It seems much more powerful than any other because it is a place where there is a focus for this kind of, punishment's a hard word, a price to be paid, where that price is to be paid. But at the unconscious level, it's difficult. It's difficult, until you understand. And then when you understand, you realize you can't do anything about it. Oh, I love the irony of that. It's the beauty of what this knowledge is about. It takes us back always to the mechanics. It always brings us back to the mechanics. If you want to live comfortably with Saturn in your design, then live as yourself. That is the only solution. If you don't live as yourself, as if you are caught in the conditioning, if you live as not self, then the position of those Saturns in your design, they are going to be thorns in your side. And they're going to be thorns that are uncomfortable and difficult to deal with and make life something not a pleasure. It's so easy just to be yourself. It's certainly much easier than to pay the cost of having to deal with Saturn. I know. I have been there, and it is one of my great joys to be at peace with Saturn. When you're finally at peace with Saturn, which basically means that, you don't really know that Saturn's even there anymore, then you can really be certain of one thing. Regardless of the circumstances of your life, regardless of the relative this and that in your life, you are living a life that is correct, a life that is truly here to be respected for its unique contribution. All hail Zeus. Today we are looking at Jupiter, and this is coming to you from Jovian Archive Radio, and it certainly is a sign of my deep respect and affection for the force that we call Jupiter. By the way, the name Jovian, as used in the organization that owns the rights to human design, the Jovian Archive is actually another name for what traditionally was known to the Brahmins as the Akasha Record. Students of mine that have attended great courses where I've talked about rave cosmology in detail will know that according to rave cosmology, Jupiter and its 4 Galilean moons represent a kind of electromagnetic central operating theater for the way in which the solar system operates and the way in which incarnation takes place. And that the the whole record of and the whole structure and coordination of the incarnative process is coordinated through that electromagnetic facility of Jupiter and its moons, the Jovian archive. To get down to the mundane and away from the mystical for a moment, Jupiter is a very powerful force, known mystically as the Logos, as the true ruler, the king of the solar system. And when we're looking at Jupiter, both the personality and the design Jupiter, what's significant for us at the mundane level is that Jupiter represents the law. The law. And of course, this is something that's exceedingly important to grasp. Each and every one of us are imprinted with a very focused theme of what is correct for us. Very focused theme, brought to you by Jupiter. And what Jupiter does is that Jupiter writes that law. And if you live by that law, you can then gain great good fortune in that sense. Look carefully at the position of the Jupiters in your design. I mean, look carefully. What you're looking at is those places where you must establish a clear, correct way for yourself. That it's written in stone. And to look at those activations and to see them very clearly, it's very important. This is your law. And to remember the binary. That it's not just a matter that the personality lives its law, but that the design lives its law as well, and that the combination of those two laws, well, the combination of those laws is a transcendent whole. It is the rule of the way for the totality as it fulfills its purpose. That's you. Jupiter is something very beautiful. It establishes for each and every one of us a very, very clear line. It's not like there's a law attached to every activation that you have. There isn't. But look very carefully, because you will see that your law, both the law of your personality and the law of your design, you better fulfill those laws. I mean, they are the thing that will hold you to the correct line in your process. It's the whole thing about the beneficence of Jupiter. Jupiter has a reputation for being grandiose and being very generous at times. And that ability to be able to benefit from the generosity only comes from that deep obedience to one's own law, and one's own law in the specific theme where you can find them in terms of the Jupiter placements in your design. It's a real meditation. Just read the lines, see clearly what's stated there, and allow that to resonate through you. And understand something. It is not a choice to honor your own law. It's not something that your mind can decide to do. As a matter of fact, the harder it is for you to understand what those laws are from the personality and the design, the deeper you are within the thrall of your own not-self. There's only one way to live your law. Operate correctly according to your mechanics. Honor your strategy and your inner authority. Make decisions as yourself. And you will see that as you make decisions as yourself, you are resonating to your law. Hello? But let's go back for a moment. When I was given this knowledge, human design was one of the many forms that I was given. There are forms for various categories of life. There's mammalian designs, and there are designs for birds, reptile, and fish, and there are designs for insects and so forth and so on, plants. what's so interesting about these other forms is that each and every one of these forms have cross-special potential, and basically what that means is that they have a gate that potentially could be part of a channel, but they don't have the channel itself. In other words, they don't have the center that's on the other side. So, for example, mammals, which have the most complex, by the way, cross-special connections to humans. They have 3. Mammals have the potential of the 62, but they don't have the 17. So, this is why that mammals are eager to learn in that sense, and that they are ready to learn from humans. The 1762 is literally where we train them. We have another connection, that is the 1222, that is the potential in the mammal for the 12, but they don't have the 22. And 2 of these cross-special patterns move towards the emotional system. In other words, the connection, this is why we tend to anthropomorphize animals that we connect to in this way. We tend to emotionalize them, we tend to feel their consciousness, they hook into our emotional sensitivity. The 1222 is about friendship. This is probably, for example, where wolf and man, or dog and man, first found their relationship, is through this channel of being social with a stranger, and being social with a stranger in the sense of a cross-special social connection, which is why mammals have become, generally speaking, the largest proportion of things we would call pets in that sense. The final cross-special connection with mammals, which has to do with Neptune, is the 1949. That is that the mammal has the 19th gate, the potential to connect to the 49, but the 49 is the butcher. And one of the things to understand about the 1949 is that this is where ritual eating, that is the tribe coming together in festivals, this is where ritual eating is. This is where animals that are sacrificed are also exalted spiritually. The 19th gate has a need for spirituality. The sacrifice of the cow, as an example, for beef, and you end up exalting it. You end up exalting it as Taurus, as a constellation in the sky. Whatever the case may be, there was this built-in spiritual relationship with the taking of meat specifically. Now, what's interesting is that the precursor to swine flu and the emergence of swine flu was the presence of Neptune in the 19th gate, which, by the way, is where it still is. And not only Neptune in the 19th gate in relationship to swine flu, but we had this occasion of it being defined with Uranus in the 49th gate, and we also had in all of that BSC and all of the other things that we have had recently in relationship to the food chain in terms of mammals. But what's so interesting about the swine flu is that it was Neptune activating the 19th gate. Now, the whole thing about Neptune is Neptune brings a veil. I mean, you can't see through that veil. It's not possible. It's like trying to understand Neptune in your own life. Well, if you lived 165 years, which is basically Neptune's rotation around the sun, and you went through a complete Neptunian cycle, maybe you would have a shot at it, but we never get that shot. I mean, despite the fact that we live long lives, we don't live to 165. And so the whole thing about Neptune is that Neptune doesn't really let us see what things are all about. They don't. And so there was all of this recognition that swine flu was there, but yet at the same time, no ability to see its limitation. Its limitation. How different Neptune is from Pluto in the 26, where you have, this cross-special connection with fish and birds and reptiles. And this is no longer you can't really see it. This is the god of the underworld. And, death and the soldier gate linked together. The underworld and the soldier gate, transmission, all of these keys. And you end up with something that can be devastating to the human population. When you're looking at Neptune in your design, recognize that if you try to get behind that veil, Neptune will trap you. It's why Neptune is associated with, alcohol and drugs and, this sense of not being able to get there. And the thing with Neptune is that wherever Neptune is in your design, on the personality or the unconscious, it's a place where you can truly learn surrender. There's nothing else you can do. There's nothing else you can do. And the beauty about the concept of surrender as it's applied to human design is that it's not a concept. It's just mechanics. Surrender is simply operating correctly. It's just operating correctly. And what you can't see doesn't matter. Hello, and one day we look at Pluto. Of course, yesterday I was talking in reference to Neptune, talking about cross-special connections. And it's so interesting about Pluto. When we had the change in 1781 from the 7th to the 9th centered being, Pluto was in the 41st gate. Now, the 41st gate is the initiating codon. This is the beginning of all experiences. And from the moment that we entered into this phase of our evolutionary process, which we live out through this nine-centered vehicle, that since that point, Pluto has been going gate by gate through its process, setting the plutonic foundation, if you will, for the whole cycle. It started in the 41st gate. We have Pluto now in the 26th gate. And of course we're looking at it, 230 odd years later, nearly coming to the end of its process of going entirely around the wheel. And one of the things to understand is that the presence of Pluto in the 26th gate, as it is right now, that this is something that has never happened before within this form. And means that the impact of this is something not only deeply, deeply powerful, but something that we're going to live with for a very long time, because we've had an enormous generation that has come into the world carrying Pluto in the 26th gate. But let's go to the Pluto in terms of what it means for each of us. Basically, Pluto is about truth, just to be simple. And of course, truth in and of itself is never simple. It's quite subjective. And this is about the personal subjective truth. It is about what you need to know as truth in your life. And Pluto points to it. And when you look at both the Pluto in the personality position or in the design position, what you're looking at is the themes of truth that you have to deal with in your life. Over these last couple of weeks, we have been traveling through and talking about each of the planets. And each of the planets with their specific quality of the way in which they filter the neutrino ocean and the way in which we live out that filtration in the end. And that if you begin to add it all up, all of the planets and the personality and the design and this and that and the nodes, you go through this whole process. And if you try to keep tabs on all of that, well, right away it's not possible. There is so much information in what it is to be us. We are nothing more than an enormous amount of concretized information. But how the whole operates, because the whole is never its parts. Never. It's greater than that. And this is the mystery and the wonder of what it is to be in form. How complex these vehicles are, let alone the complexity that we can, explore analytically in terms of the knowledge of human design. But just think about the complexity for a moment at a biological level, at a genetic level, at any kind of level that you want to look at in the true physical sense of the word. Imagine what it would be like if you were responsible for being in control of breathing and body movements and all of these things. You wouldn't. It would drive you mad. It's not possible. It's an incredible thing. And this whole that we give an identity to, that we call our separated, unique being, our self, this whole, there is no way that we control what it is. We can experience it. This is the awakeness. The potential of awakeness is to experience the whole. And there's only one way to get there. You get there in the vehicle. You don't get there out of the vehicle. You're in it. You're in it. And to be able to get to a place where you stop interfering with it, where you get to a place where you surrender to the fact that you are not the vehicle, you are not the driver, that you're just a passenger on a journey, and to allow the journey to unfold and to experience it as you should. True magic in the moment that you realize something very simple. If you operate correctly, all those aspects, whatever they are, that are you, the this and the that, the exalted, the detriment, the single, the split, the defined, the undefined, it doesn't matter what it is. What matters is how the whole lives. Does it live correctly or not? And if it lives correctly, then it's simply following a simple strategy. It's honoring a very straightforward authority. Nothing more, nothing less. Enjoy your relationship with these forces. It is really something fascinating to experience them physically within you, to know they're there, to feel the connection, to know what it's like to be emotionalized by this or that, or intellectualized by this or that, or whatever the conditioning force happens to be. To have a taste for them, to have a sense of your place within the whole, but not to do anything about it, not to do anything with it, just to be a good passenger, a witness of being.